Hello, everyone. I'm John, and welcome back to ASMR True Crime Story, where I share true stories in a calm, relaxing whisper. Before we begin, press a number in the comments for me. Press 1 if you're already part of our ASMR family. Press 0 if this is your first time here. And press 2 if you want another whispered true story in the next upload. If you're enjoying the calm, please like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you don't miss tomorrow's case. Now, get comfortable, settle in, and slow your breathing. Let's begin. Story 1. Rachel Helene Timmerman came into the world on April 6, 1970, in the city of Grand Rapids, Michigan. From the moment she was born, life seemed ready to test her in ways no child should have to face. She was the middle child, with one sister and one brother. And together the three learned very early that safety, comfort, and stability were not things they could count on. Her parents' relationship broke apart when Rachel was still young. The separation left her mother solely responsible for raising the children, but responsibility was not something she embraced. The household did not run on schedules, care, or attention. It ran on neglect. Rachel's mother could be described in the kindest terms as detached. Food was not always there when the children were hungry. Clothing was not always clean, warm, or even properly fitted. There were days when the basics, things every child should have without question, were simply absent. And when it came to love, patience, and the emotional presence that children depend on, there was even less. Education was not a priority in the home. Rachel and her siblings were not encouraged to attend school regularly. Sometimes they missed entire stretches of classes, with no one urging them to go back. When a child spends too much time away from the classroom, the gap in learning widens quickly, and the weight of that gap can make returning feel impossible. Rachel began to fall behind, not because she lacked intelligence, but because her environment did not give her the tools to succeed. Even when she wanted to try, there were barriers. Poverty has a way of following children to school. Clothes that aren't clean or shoes that are worn thin can make them the subject of quiet whispers or open ridicule. The absence of a lunch, or the embarrassment of a lunch that looks different from everyone else's, can feel crushing when you are young. Rachel experienced this often. She knew the feeling of entering a classroom already bracing for someone to notice the frayed edges of her shirt, or the fact that she had nothing to eat at midday. For a child, these moments build a quiet fear, a fear of being seen and judged. That fear can become stronger than the desire to learn. So she began skipping more. Each absence made the next one easier. School became less a place of learning and more a place of discomfort. In time, it faded from her daily life almost entirely. By her teenage years, the absence of structure at home and the disconnection from school left Rachel searching for belonging elsewhere. She found it among other young people who, like her, had been left to drift. And in that drifting, there were escapes: alcohol, drugs, and the thrill of living without rules. The substances offered a way to quiet the feelings she carried: the loneliness, the neglect, the sense that she was already falling behind in a race everyone else seemed to understand. The nights spent drinking or getting high were nights she didn't have to think about the life she wanted, but couldn't quite reach. At 13, the state of Michigan stepped in. A social worker was assigned to her, tasked with guiding her back toward school and providing the support her home life lacked. The social worker did what she could, checking in, encouraging her, and trying to show her that a different path was possible. Rachel respected her, even liked her, but at that point, her priorities were elsewhere. Parties held more pull than classrooms. The rush of being with friends, staying out late, and ignoring the rules felt more real to her than the distant promise of a diploma. The social worker could offer guidance, but Rachel had to choose to take it. And for those years, she didn't. Life continued like that until the fall of 1995, when something happened that would change everything. At 17, Rachel discovered she was pregnant. The news landed with weight. It could have been another reason to spiral, but instead, something shifted in her. The idea of a child, her child, pulled her attention away from the chaos. She began to think about the kind of life she wanted to give this baby and how different she hoped it would be from her own. From that moment, she stopped drinking. She stopped using drugs. It wasn't easy, but she was determined. The cycles of neglect and damage that had shaped her own childhood would not touch her daughter. She would do better, even if it meant walking away from everything familiar. 9 months later, on June 15th, 1996, Rachel gave birth to a baby girl she named Shannon Dale. Shannon had soft tufts of blonde hair and deep blue eyes that seemed to study the world with calm curiosity. She was an easy baby, happy, content, quick to smile. Rachel adored her. Caring for Shannon became the center of her life. Every choice she made was measured against one question: will this be good for her? For the first time, Rachel had something that was fully hers, and she wanted to protect it with everything she had. But motherhood, or at 18, is never simple. The long nights, the constant demands, and the weight of responsibility could wear down anyone, especially someone who had only just begun to steady her own life. After 2 months of being almost constantly at home, Rachel was offered a rare break, an evening out with a friend she trusted. Her sister and brother agreed to watch Shannon, and Rachel planned to spend the night playing cards and relaxing with Wayne Davis, a family friend. Wayne told her they'd be meeting up with his friend Marvin Gabriel and Marvin's nephew Mike, someone Rachel knew from school. The plan sounded harmless, a simple night to get out and breathe. She couldn't have known how quickly it would turn dark. That summer evening in August of 1996 felt like a small gift to Rachel. It had been weeks since she'd done anything purely for herself. Shannon was just over 2 months old, and as much as Rachel loved her, she knew she needed to recharge. The thought of sitting at a table, laughing over cards, and being surrounded by familiar voices seemed like exactly what she needed. Wayne Davis arrived as planned. Rachel said goodbye to her sister and brother, reminding them that Shannon's bottle was in the fridge and her blanket was in the crib. She stepped outside into the warm air, feeling lighter than she had in months. The group met up as Wayne had said they would. Wayne, his friend Marvin, and Marvin's nephew Mike. Rachel already knew Mike from school. Marvin, though, was different. She didn't know much about him beyond what Wayne had mentioned in passing, that he was a friend of his. Marvin was a few years older, his manner quiet, and though Rachel noticed something in his presence that felt off, she pushed it aside. This was Wayne's friend, and Wayne had always looked out for her. The night began without incident. They sat around a table, cards in hand, drinks being poured, conversation drifting from topic to topic. It felt like the kind of low-key evening Rachel had hoped for. Familiar faces, light talk, a sense of normalcy. But later, as the night wound down and the four of them headed back toward home, the atmosphere began to change. Marvin was driving. Wayne and Mike sat in the back, Rachel in the passenger seat. At some point, Marvin pulled the car off the main road and onto a quieter stretch that led deeper into the trees. Rachel didn't understand why they were stopping. Then Marvin told Wayne and Mike to get out. The tone in his voice left no room for argument. Neither of them asked why, and neither resisted. They stepped out into the night, the sound of the car doors closing behind them. Rachel stayed in her seat, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. Marvin drove off with her, still inside, leaving Wayne and Mike behind. She didn't know where they were going, only that the road seemed to grow narrower and darker with every turn. When he finally stopped, the surroundings were unfamiliar. A secluded spot with no lights, no houses, no signs of life. Rachel's fear grew. She pleaded with him, her voice trembling, asking him to just take her home. But her words didn't slow him. He told her to get out of the car. She hesitated, knowing that nothing good could come from being out here alone with him. But with no one else around, she had little choice. She stepped out into the stillness, her heart pounding. What followed was a nightmare she would never be able to erase. Marvin attacked her. She tried to push him away to fight, but he was stronger. He struck her, forcing her to the ground. The gravel bit into her skin. She cried out, begging him to stop, but her voice was swallowed by the night. He didn't stop. His violence was relentless. At one point, he struck her head repeatedly against the hard earth. At another, he bit her face, hard enough to tear the skin along her nose. Every part of her hurt. The physical pain was matched only by the shock and disbelief that this was happening. When it was over, he ordered her back into the car. Blood blurred her vision. Her clothes were filthy. Every movement hurt. She sat in the passenger seat, stunned, as he started driving again. As the headlights swept over the road, Rachel realized they were heading toward her home. Relief flickered, brief and fragile, at the thought that she was close to safety. But something in Marvin's posture, the way his grip tightened on the wheel, made her stay tense. When they reached the trailer where she lived with her mother and sister, she acted quickly. She slipped out of the car and ran inside, the taste of panic sharp in her mouth. Her sister Sarah had been awake just moments earlier, putting Shannon down to sleep. She was startled by the sound of the front door bursting open. Rachel stood there, face bloodied, clothes disheveled, eyes wide with terror. In her hand, she clutched a hammer. Before Sarah could even ask what had happened, a voice shouted from outside, a man's voice, full of anger. Marvin was at the door, pounding, yelling that Rachel was going to pay for what she did. Sarah's gaze darted from the door to her sister's face. Whatever had happened out there, she could tell it was worse than anything she could imagine. She picked up another hammer and stood beside Rachel, both of them frozen in fear as the pounding continued. Rachel shouted back for him to leave. He didn't. For minutes, he kept yelling and striking the door. Then, finally, the noise stopped. When he was gone, the silence felt heavy. Sarah tried to get Rachel to explain what had happened, but Rachel could barely speak. She shook, her words tangled in sobs. When Sarah suggested calling the police, Rachel shook her head violently. No police. Instead, she reached for the two people she trusted most, her brother and her social worker. When they arrived and saw her condition, dirty, bleeding, bruised, they were horrified. They urged her to tell them the truth. Through broken sentences, Rachel finally did. She told them about Marvin, about what he had done, and about the threat he made to kill her and her baby if she told anyone. The fear in her voice was enough to make them believe that threat was real. It took time for Rachel's brother and her social worker to convince her that going to the police was the right thing to do. Every time they suggested it, she pictured Marvin's face, heard the words he had said about killing her and Shannon, and felt her stomach tighten. Her hesitation wasn't just fear. It was also the weight of shame that victims often carry. Shame that didn't belong to her, but still clung to her all the same. She worried about how people would see her, about the questions they might ask, and about whether anyone would even believe her. But they kept talking to her, reminding her that staying silent would only leave him free to hurt someone else. Gradually, the thought of another woman going through what she had endured began to matter more to her than her own fear. Finally, she agreed. Rachel went to the Newaygo County Sheriff's Department and told them what had happened. She described the night, the attack, the threats. She didn't soften the details. It was a brave thing to do, and everyone who cared about her knew it. The deputies moved quickly to speak with Marvin. They reached him by phone, and he agreed to come in the next morning to give his side of the story. Morning came, but Marvin didn't. Instead, the department received a fax from him, a 5-page statement. The very fact that he sent it by fax instead of showing up in person was strange, But what it contained was stranger still. In his version of events, there had been no attack. He claimed that Rachel had willingly been with him that night, that she had offered him sexual favors while they were in the car. He wrote that he asked Wayne and Mike to step out so they could be alone. Then, according to his account, they drove to a secluded spot where she followed through on the offer. The story didn't stop there. He claimed that afterward, Rachel had taken things further in a bizarre and implausible way. A detail so unlikely it made the entire account sound more like a poorly thought out cover than the truth. He said she then asked for more, but he refused. In his telling, there had been no violence, no struggle. He offered explanations for her injuries that were as flimsy as they were unbelievable. Perhaps his dog had nipped her nose when she sat on its tail. Perhaps she had hurt herself while helping him push the car when it got stuck. For the investigators, the gaps and contradictions in Marvin's story were glaring. Rachel, meanwhile, had gone to the hospital after the attack. The medical examination left no doubt about what had happened to her. The rape kit confirmed physical trauma, severe enough that the doctor's notes described tearing, bruising from head to toe, and human bite marks on her nose. These injuries didn't come from an accidental bump or a dog's nip. They told the story Rachel had already spoken aloud, a violent assault. But for Rachel, this was only the beginning of her ordeal. She had reported the crime, and her attacker was now free, knowing exactly what she had told the police. The wait for the case to move forward felt long, too long. It would take 5 months from the time she reported the assault for the prosecutor to file charges. When they did, Marvin was charged with third-degree criminal sexual conduct, a felony that carried a possible 15-year prison sentence. During that time, Rachel tried to rebuild her life. She and Shannon moved into her father's house. She got a job at a fast food restaurant nearby and began thinking about studying for her GED. For the first time in a while, she was making plans again. But the shadow of the upcoming trial hung over her. When the arrest finally happened in January 1997, the warrant listed the witnesses who would testify against Marvin. Rachel's name was there. Less than 2 weeks later, Marvin was out on bail. The man who posted it was Wayne Davis. The same Wayne who had invited Rachel out that night, the one who had been there before the assault. To Rachel, it was baffling and unsettling. Wayne had been expected to testify for the prosecution. Why would he help Marvin walk free? Her friends and family had their own theories, that Wayne might have been intimidated, pressured, or even threatened. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. Marvin was free again. Rachel's anxiety deepened. She had already seen how dangerous he could be. Now, with the trial date drawing closer, she couldn't shake the feeling that he might try to silence her before she could testify. She wasn't wrong to worry. Not long after Marvin's release on bail, another unsettling event shook the case. Wayne Davis, the man who had once been seen as a friend to Rachel and an important witness for the prosecution, was scheduled to appear in court on February 13, 1997. The matter had nothing to do with Rachel's case. It was for a driving under the influence charge. Wayne had been through the system before, and he expected that this time he might have to serve around 90 days in the county jail. In preparation, he asked a woman he knew, a friend named Darlene, to give him a ride to court that day. Before they headed there, he told her he wanted to stop to buy puzzle books and cigarettes, small comforts to pass the time if he was sentenced as he expected. On the morning of his hearing, Darlene arrived at his home. She waited in the car at first, but when Wayne didn't come out, she went to the door and rang the bell. There was no answer. Thinking maybe he had stepped out for a moment, she waited a little longer, then tried calling his phone from a nearby payphone. Still no answer. She returned to his house several times that day, each time finding the same silence. 2 days later, she went back again. This time, she found something taped to the door, a note with Wayne's signature. In it, he wrote, that he had decided to leave for California because he was afraid of being sent to jail. The note didn't sit right with her. She knew Wayne wasn't afraid of serving a short sentence, and he had been fully prepared for the possibility. Stepping inside the house, she saw that personal belongings he would never willingly leave behind, including a jacket from his time in the army, were still there. Something about it felt wrong. And then she remembered. The day before, she was supposed to drive Wayne to court. She had seen him with Marvin. It was a troubling thought, and she wasn't the only one to have it. 2 weeks later, Marvin appeared at a consignment shop in another town with stereo equipment and a microwave that had belonged to Wayne. He put them up for sale. The connection between the two men and the timing of Wayne's disappearance cast a heavy shadow over the upcoming trial. Wayne's absence meant that a key witness for Rachel's case would not be there to testify. But Wayne's disappearance wasn't the only problem. Marvin had been using the months before trial to change attorneys multiple times, each change causing delays as the new lawyers needed time to review the case. The date for the trial shifted again and again until finally it was set for June 5th, 1997. Rachel tried to stay focused on her job in caring for Shannon, but her nerves were wearing thin. She had already called the sheriff's office twice to report seeing Marvin nearby, each time afraid that he was keeping his promise to harm her. She did her best to keep her routine steady, but there was always the feeling that something was closing in. And in the days just before the trial, a new name entered her life: John Weeks. John had gotten her phone number from someone she knew. He seemed friendly, polite, and respectful when they spoke. Their conversations became more frequent, and slowly, Rachel began to feel comfortable with him. 2 days before the trial, John suggested they meet in person. Rachel hesitated. She had no one to watch Shannon. He told her it wasn't a problem. She could bring her daughter along, and he'd be happy to meet her. On June 3rd, 1997, Rachel told her family she was going out to meet John. She dressed for the day, gathered Shannon, and waited for him to arrive. She never came home. The next day, Rachel's father received an envelope. Inside was a letter, written in Rachel's handwriting. She apologized for leaving without saying goodbye. She said she had decided to run off and get married. She promised that once she had an address, she would write again. Her father read the words more than once. Rachel had been nervous about the trial, yes. She could be impulsive, yes. But leaving like this, taking Shannon with her, not telling anyone in the family, was unlike her. Still, part of him thought it was possible she simply wanted to escape the weight of what was ahead. For the prosecutors, the letter was more troubling. Their key witness had vanished. When the trial date arrived on June 5th, they had to ask the judge for a postponement. Without Rachel's testimony, the case couldn't move forward. Then, as if to seal the matter, another letter arrived, this time addressed to both the prosecutor and the judge. The handwriting again matched Rachel's. In this one, she claimed that Marvin had not attacked her after all. She said she had been angry that he refused her advances and had made up the accusation to teach him a lesson. She asked that the charges be dropped. The words were strange, contradictory to everything she had told police, to everything the evidence showed. But there was no sign of her, and without her cooperation, the case collapsed. The charges against Marvin were dropped. Her family wasn't convinced by the letters. The tone wasn't Rachel's. The idea of her moving away and marrying someone without telling those closest to her felt wrong. Shannon's paternal grandmother, Kim, was especially suspicious. She had been involved in her granddaughter's life from the start, even though her son, Shannon's father, lived in Florida. Kim believed Rachel would never relocate without telling her, and certainly would never cut off contact altogether. Weeks passed. Then, on June 14th, one day before Shannon's first birthday, another letter arrived. Rachel wrote that the man she had run away with was named Mar. She said he had found a job in Arkansas and that she was thinking about staying there permanently. Kim didn't believe it for a moment. Something was wrong. A month after Rachel was last seen, a fisherman named Douglas and his son-in-law were out on Oxford Lake, a quiet, out-of-the-way body of water. To Douglas, it was less a lake than a deep, muddy hole in the woods. Good for fishing, but not a place you stumbled upon by accident. As they drifted across the water, something caught their attention. A cement block floated near an object that, from a distance, looked like a target dummy used for shooting practice. Curious and uneasy, they paddled closer. The smell reached them before they could see clearly. It was strong, unmistakable. Whatever this was, it wasn't a target dummy. Douglas's mind raced. They were alone in a remote spot, and what they had found might be a body. He didn't know if whoever had put it there might still be nearby. He and his son-in-law turned the boat back toward shore, moving quickly, and once they reached their cabin, they called the sheriff's department. The recovery was difficult. The body was wrapped in debris from the lake, the eyes and mouth covered with duct tape, the hands cuffed behind the back. Chains connected the body to 63 pounds of concrete blocks. It was a woman. The medical examiner worked carefully, eventually noting scars from hip surgeries and from a cesarean section. At first, investigators thought she might be older, perhaps in her 40s or 50s, because of the hip surgery marks. But when they spoke to Rachel's family, they learned she had undergone those surgeries at just 13. She also had a C-section scar from Shannon's birth. DNA confirmed it. The woman in the lake was Rachel Timmerman, and she had been alive when she was thrown in. The discovery changed everything. It was no longer just a missing person case. It was now a homicide, and a child, only 11 months old, was missing. Because Rachel's body had been found in a section of Oxford Lake that lay within a national forest, federal jurisdiction applied. That meant the FBI joined the investigation. The area around the lake was searched again, this time with cadaver dogs. The dogs alerted in certain spots, suggesting there might be more remains nearby. But after careful digging, nothing more was found. For Shannon's case, the FBI worked with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They created nationwide alerts and distributed missing persons flyers across the state. A special tip line was set up, but no solid leads came in. Investigators began working outward from Rachel, tracing her connections and looking closely at the people who had last been with her. Shannon's father, Rick, was one of the first names on their list, but he had been in Florida at the time and his alibi was solid. He had no motive. He was paying child support and had a good relationship with Rachel's side of the family. That left one name at the center, Marvin Gabriel. He had threatened Rachel before. He had threatened Shannon. He had already benefited from Rachel's disappearance. Without her testimony, the charges against him had been dropped. Now she was gone, and her baby was missing. The FBI soon discovered that someone named Gabriel was renting a house in a rural community called Altona. It was a quiet, mostly Amish area. If Marvin was there, he had chosen the location carefully. It was the kind of place where strangers stood out and where news traveled slowly. When agents visited the property in July, no one answered the door. But there was smoke rising from the chimney, even though it was the middle of summer and the temperatures were in the 90s. It looked as if someone was burning something inside. Around the property, they saw cinder blocks, the same type that had been found chained to Rachel's body. These blocks were marked with distinctive red paint. Unable to enter without a warrant, the agents turned to the neighbors. They learned that Marvin had been seen regularly with a young man who helped him with odd jobs. The two had become close, but recently both had disappeared. The young man's name was John Weeks. When agents tracked down John's girlfriend, she confirmed she hadn't seen him in about 2 weeks. She also said she'd never known Marvin by his real name. John had always called him Lance. She didn't report John missing because he had told her he was going to Texas with Lance to buy a large quantity of marijuana. She assumed he would be gone for a while and that he didn't want her to worry. But then she mentioned something else. At one point, she had overheard John on the phone with a woman named Rachel. When she confronted him, he told her it wasn't what she thought, that he wasn't cheating on her. He said he was doing a favor for Lance. It was the connection the FBI needed. John had been the one to lure Rachel out of her home with Shannon that day. The next step was to test the red painted cinder blocks from Marvin's property. When compared to the ones found in Oxford Lake, they were a match. That was enough for a warrant. When agents returned, Marvin still wasn't there, but some of his relatives were out, and they were loading items into the back of a truck. The agents stopped them and made them put everything back exactly where they had found it. Inside the house, they found more damning clues. Duct tape used for hanging curtains, cans of red spray paint, padlock keys that matched the kind used on the chains around Rachel's body, and a book titled The Perfect Victim. None of it proved exactly what had happened to Rachel or Shannon, but it painted a clear picture. Marvin Gabriel was dangerous, and now he was on the run. By the time the FBI finished their search of the house in Altona, Marvin Gabriel was gone. The agents didn't know exactly how long he had been on the run, but they were certain of one thing: he wasn't moving aimlessly. From speaking with his family and others who had known him, investigators learned that Marvin had a habit of using multiple names. He made his living through scams, manipulating people, and exploiting loopholes. He could be charming when he wanted something, and he could be frighteningly violent when he didn't get it. One relative finally admitted to agents that Marvin had been using several aliases and that he had a history of lashing out when crossed. There were rumors of people who had feared him enough to stay silent even when they had reason to speak. The investigation soon took another turn. The property in Altona, where Marvin had been living, didn't actually belong to him. It belonged to a man named Robert Allen. Allen was known to have a history with drugs and to move around frequently, but his family hadn't seen him since 1995, nearly 2 years earlier. They had never reported him missing. They assumed he had simply left, as he sometimes did, but continued receiving his Social Security payments. What they didn't know was that those checks had been cashed by Marvin for the past 2 years. That raised the possibility that Robert Allen might be another victim. Back in Altona, the FBI revisited neighbors to see if anyone had noticed something unusual. One man recalled being up around 3 in the morning, getting ready for work, on the night Rachel disappeared. He said he had seen Marvin outside grinding something off an aluminum rowboat. Marvin then loaded chains and 3 cinder blocks into the boat before towing it away. It was a chilling detail, one that matched what had been found in Oxford Lake. Word of Marvin being wanted spread, and before long, a former landlord contacted the FBI. He told them that when Marvin had left one of his rental properties in the past, he'd left behind clippings from department store catalogs. They were pictures of children modeling swimsuits and underwear. The images had been cut out and saved. The landlord also had more to say, but that would come later. For now, the search for Marvin continued. In mid-July, a break came from within his own family. His nephew Mike, the same Mike who had been in the car the night Rachel was taken, contacted the FBI. He said the last he had heard, Marvin was staying at a campground near Hungerford Lake. Agents searched the area, but found the campsite abandoned. What they did find was unsettling: a baby's bottle, a disposable diaper, and a hair barrette that Rachel's family confirmed had belonged to her. The discovery gave investigators a flicker of hope that Shannon might still be alive, but it also deepened their worry. Marvin managed to stay ahead of law enforcement for 3 more months. Then, in October 1997, another lead surfaced. someone who had been working with Marvin in a scam, told agents that he sent Marvin money every other Tuesday to a post office box in upstate New York. The FBI decided to wait for the next payment date and watch the post office. On October 14th, Marvin appeared, collected the envelope, and began to walk away. Agents moved in. He tried to run, but he didn't get far. Within minutes, Marvin Gabriel was in custody. From the start, he refused to answer investigators' questions, speaking only through his lawyer. But he had another way of communicating, one that was just as disturbing. From his jail cell, Marvin began sending letters. Some went to newspapers, some to witnesses in his case, and some directly to Rachel's family. The letters to her family were the most cruel. In one, he told Rachel's mother that her daughter's death was her fault. He described in chilling detail how Rachel had been thrown into the lake alive, how large bubbles had risen as she struggled, and how she had fought against her restraints before the water finally took her. It was calculated cruelty, meant to cause pain, to keep his presence in their minds, even from behind bars. The FBI encouraged Rachel's family to respond, hoping Marvin might slip and reveal something about Shannon. Shannon's grandmother, Kim, spoke with him more than once, desperate for answers. She asked him outright if the baby was in the lake. No, he told her. I know for a fact she's not in the lake. But inmates who were locked up with Marvin later said that when they taunted him about what had happened to the child, he admitted that he had put her in the water because he didn't know what else to do with her. In 2001, another search of Oxford Lake was carried out, this time draining water and removing hundreds of cubic yards of sediment. No trace of Shannon was found. By the time Marvin's trial for Rachel's murder approached, more stories about his past began to surface. Some of these accounts went back years before Rachel's death, painting a picture of a man whose violence and intimidation had touched many lives. In 1996, the same year Rachel was attacked, Marvin had been accused of assaulting the wife of a friend. She said he had grabbed her inappropriately, touching her chest and between her legs. When she told him to leave, he refused. Only when she returned with a gun did he walk out the door. Months later, he tried to get into bed with his sister-in-law's niece. She told him to get out or she would scream. The next morning, her dog was missing. She later told police that Marvin had threatened to put her body where no one would ever find it. The same words he used when talking about what happened to her dog. Also, in 1996, Marvin rented a room in a large boarding house in Cutlerville, Michigan. Other tenants began complaining to the landlord about his behavior. One said Marvin had threatened to kill him over a minor disagreement. Another said Marvin had entered her room without permission and exposed himself. The landlord's most troubling memory was of catching Marvin outside, looking into the window of a 12-year-old girl, the daughter of another tenant. Marvin was rubbing himself as he watched. When the landlord told him to leave, Marvin refused, insisting he was entitled to 60 days' notice. The landlord's wife called the police. In retaliation, Marvin came into their kitchen, picked up a knife, and threatened to slit her throat. Incidents like this seemed to follow him everywhere he went. In 1997, while playing cards at a friend's house, he became angry when the host paused the game to help his uncle with medication. Marvin accused the man of kicking his dog. When told to leave, Marvin instead picked up the dog and threw it against a wall. When the man tried to stop him, Marvin grabbed him by the throat, pushed him to the ground, and began choking him. He kicked him in the ribs and attacked the man's wife when she tried to help, slamming her head to the floor. The couple's 10-year-old son jumped on Marvin to protect his parents, but Marvin threw the boy across the room and punched him in the head. Before leaving, he told the family that if they called the police, he would finish what he started. Most of these incidents were never reported, or if they were, charges didn't stick. The people who knew Marvin understood what he was capable of and many were too afraid to push for justice. Then there was the story from a neighbor who had once called police after shots were fired from Marvin's second-floor window. When officers entered the home to search, they found something deeply disturbing. On the floor was a frog, its limbs pinned wide apart. Next to it was a doll posed in the same way. Around them was a mix of dried and undried bodily fluids. It was a dark window into Marvin's mind. One more piece in the portrait of a man who was not just violent, but deeply disturbed. For investigators, the stories confirm what they already believed. Rachel's death had not been an isolated act. It was part of a pattern that stretched back years, a trail of threats, intimidation, cruelty, and control. But when it came to prosecuting him, they had to focus on the case that could hold in court: the murder of Rachel Timmerman. And because Rachel's body had been found in a part of Oxford Lake within federal land, the case would be tried in federal court. That meant the death penalty was on the table, even though Michigan had abolished it more than a century earlier. Because Rachel's body had been found in a section of Oxford Lake that lay within the Manistee National Forest, federal jurisdiction applied. That meant this case would not be tried in a Michigan state court. It would be the United States versus Marvin Gabrion. The location was more than just a legal detail. On federal land, the death penalty could be pursued, something Michigan itself had abolished back in the 1800s. In fact, if the jury found him guilty, Marvin could become the first person sentenced to death in the state in decades. The prosecutors knew their case hinged on proving exactly where Rachel's death had occurred. The defense would argue that her body could have been placed in the lake from private property. But investigators had studied the lake carefully. Its floor was choked with sediment and plant life. The currents were weak. There was no realistic way for her body to have drifted from the private side to the area where she was found. The medical examiner's testimony added to the picture. Rachel had been alive when she entered the water, her hands cuffed, her face and mouth bound with duct tape, chains pulling her down. The cinder blocks had snagged in the lake bed, keeping her in the same place where she had been dropped. The jury listened to the evidence, the timeline, the threats Marvin had made, the fake letters in Rachel's handwriting, the discovery of the matching cinder blocks on his property. Witness after witness described his history of intimidation and violence. When the verdict came, the jury found him guilty, and when it came time to sentence him, they chose death. It was history. Marvin became the first person in Michigan since 1937 to be sentenced to death, and the first in modern times to receive it in a state that did not allow the death penalty under its own laws. But the legal process did not end there. In 2011, Marvin appealed both his conviction and his sentence. His lawyers argued that the jury should have been told that if the trial had been held in state court, the death penalty would not have been an option. They also claimed the judge had not explained the concept of reasonable doubt clearly enough. The appeals court upheld his conviction, but it overturned the death sentence. That decision, however, was challenged, and in 2013, the death penalty was reinstated. Marvin tried again in 2018, but his appeal was denied. He remains on death row. For Rachel's family, there is still no closure. Shannon's whereabouts remain unknown. Robert Allen, Wayne Davis, and John Weeks, all connected to Marvin, have never been found. Investigators believe they were likely killed, but without physical evidence, those cases remain open. The prosecutors had chosen to focus on the murder they could prove beyond any doubt, Rachel's. It was the only way to secure the maximum penalty and keep Marvin from hurting anyone else. Yet for those who knew and loved Rachel, and for those who wonder what happened to Shannon, there are questions that will never be answered. Rachel's story is one of courage met with cruelty. She was a young woman who had grown up in difficult circumstances, determined to give her daughter the kind of love and stability she herself had rarely known. She could have chosen silence after that night in 1996. She could have turned away from the trial, avoided the risk, and stayed quiet. But she didn't. She chose to speak. She chose to stand up for herself, and in doing so, she put herself in danger. The letters, the threats, the way she was taken, all of it was meant to break her spirit. But even in her final moments, bound in the darkness of that lake, she left a mark that could not be erased. Her courage in coming forward helped expose a man who had left a trail of harm behind him for years. And yet, there's a shadow that will never lift. Shannon's whereabouts remain a mystery. The same is true for Robert Allen, Wayne Davis, and John Weeks, all connected to Marvin Gabrion, all gone without a trace. For their families, the questions will never stop. Rachel's family carries the ache of not knowing. They carry the memory of a baby's first smile, first laugh, first steps, and the hole left when those moments were cut short. It is a reminder that behind every headline, every trial, and every verdict, there are people whose lives are forever changed. And for some, justice is only partial. Now, as we close this chapter, I want you to take a slow breath. Let Rachel's name stay with you. Let Shannon's name stay with you. Because remembering them, quietly, gently, is one way we keep them from disappearing entirely. And when you're ready, let's all move into our next story. If you've been listening until now and you haven't yet, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps keep these stories alive, and it lets me share more of them with you. Let's begin. Story 2. Erin had grown up in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, a small town with quiet streets and a steady rhythm. Those who knew her described her as a gentle soul, someone who smiled easily, laughed softly, and had a way of making people feel seen. When she spoke to someone, even in passing, they often felt as if they were the most important person in the room. There was a warmth in her manner that made people comfortable, and she carried a sense of kindness that seemed genuine and unforced. She loved animals, especially horses. That love wasn't just a passing interest, it was part of her identity. She would happily spend hours in a stable, brushing a mane or feeding a favorite horse, content in the company of creatures that could not speak but seemed to understand her all the same. For her, animals were more than companions. They were steady, loyal, and trustworthy in ways she valued deeply. Her closest bond as a child was with a horse named Autumn. It was said that the world seemed to revolve around Autumn in Erin's eyes. She spoke about the horse with affection, often sharing stories and small details as if speaking about a dear friend. It was a connection that reflected her ability to form deep, lasting attachments. It was in this quiet chapter of her life, surrounded by familiar faces and routines, that Erin met a boy who would eventually become central to her story. His name was Jonathan. The two crossed paths at a local gathering place, an ordinary setting for what would turn into a life-defining relationship. But their first meeting wasn't under romantic circumstances. In fact, when they first became acquainted, Erin was only in the first grade. Jonathan was a year older, and at that age, the idea of marriage was little more than something children might joke about. Yet, the connection between them began early. They became close friends, sharing conversations, small adventures, and the kind of innocent companionship that sometimes plants the seeds for something more in the future. Years passed. By the time Erin was in her mid-teens, she and Jonathan had maintained that bond, even as they grew into different versions of themselves. When she turned 16, Jonathan approached her parents to ask for permission to officially date her. It was a gesture that reflected a traditional respect for her family's role in her life, something not as common among teenagers. Her parents approved, and the two began a romantic relationship. Their young love was the sort that seemed, at least from the outside, destined for something lasting. They exchanged handwritten poems, small expressions of affection that spoke of a shared world only they understood. In photos and moments seen by others, they appeared to be the perfect all-American couple, swept up in a kind of fairy tale romance that those around them couldn't help but notice. As the relationship deepened, Jonathan joined the Marines. His decision to serve was a significant one, and it meant their young love would be tested by distance, change, and the uncertainty that military life can bring. Not long after he enlisted, the couple married in November of 2012. For Aaron's mother, the wedding was bittersweet. She wanted her daughter to be happy, but she also knew the challenges ahead. Military life was demanding. Families often had to relocate, sometimes to places far from home. Erin was naturally quiet, and her mother wondered if making new friends again and again might be a struggle for her. Still, despite these concerns, Erin and Jonathan appeared happy in those first months, building their life together with the optimism of youth. Of course, as with many marriages, especially those involving military service, the reality was more complex than the photograph suggested, but at that time, Erin could not have known how dramatically her life was going to change, or how the choices she and others would make in the years ahead would lead to a story that no one in Oak Ridge could have imagined. By September of 2013, Erin and Jonathan's journey together had taken them far from Tennessee. Jonathan's assignment brought them to the Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center in 29 Palms, California. The base was surrounded by vast stretches of desert, miles of sand and scrub, with heat that could press down like a heavy blanket during the day. Their new apartment was modest but serviceable, one of many in a complex that housed other military families. It wasn't long before they began meeting their neighbors. Friendships came quickly in such settings. Everyone understood the demands of military life and the need to create a support system far from home. Directly below their unit lived a couple named Connor and Aisling, who had a young child. A short walk away, in another unit, lived Christopher Lee and his wife Nicole, along with their 6-year-old daughter Liberty. Between household responsibilities, deployments, and long work hours for the husbands, the wives often leaned on one another for company. It started with casual chats in the courtyard or shared meals, but soon they were spending more time together, having lunch, visiting each other's homes, and holding small gatherings. When the husbands were home, the group might have a barbecue or a movie night. It wasn't just a social arrangement. It was a way to feel less alone in a place that could otherwise be isolating. In those early months at 29 Palms, life seemed steady. Erin and Jonathan were adjusting, sharing the normal ups and downs of marriage. But as the weeks turned to months, the strains that often surface in young relationships began to appear. One of the most common points of friction was money. Their budget was tight, and disagreements over spending became more frequent. Each accused the other of unnecessary purchases, and minor financial decisions could spark arguments. Yet, even with these disputes, there were moments of shared excitement, especially when Erin discovered she was expecting their first child. The news shifted the focus of their conversations. Whatever disagreements they had were set aside as they looked ahead to becoming parents. Erin was thrilled, imagining the life they would build and the role she would play as a mother. She shared the news publicly, posting about her pregnancy on social media so friends and family back home could join in the celebration. For a time, her joy seemed to replace the earlier tension. But joy has a way of being fragile. Not long after making her announcement, Erin suffered a miscarriage. The loss was devastating. She had been so ready to embrace motherhood, and now the dream was gone. Statistics might say that many pregnancies end this way, but numbers offered no comfort. The emotional impact was deep and personal. Erin withdrew, not only from Jonathan, but from the circle of friends she had begun to form. Her husband admitted later that he didn't know how to comfort her. He tried, but the gap between them seemed to widen with each passing day. It was during this time, when she was at her most vulnerable, that Erin found herself talking more with one particular neighbor, Christopher Lee. Erin was 19 then, still young, still figuring out her place in the world, and now carrying the weight of loss that few her age had experienced. She spent more time alone, her thoughts circling around the pregnancy she had wanted so badly. Jonathan, though present, couldn't bridge the emotional gap between them. He didn't know what to say, and his attempts at comfort often fell flat. Christopher Lee, their neighbor, was different. He was 25, older than Erin, and known among friends for a sense of humor. He liked making people laugh, but beneath the surface, he carried struggles of his own. Recently, he had been denied deployment, a blow that left him disappointed and restless. For him, serving overseas wasn't something to avoid. It was something he had wanted and now couldn't have. That disappointment fed into a quiet frustration. He even told Erin once that he would sometimes play Russian roulette in the mornings, a dangerous game where a gun is loaded with a single round, the cylinder spun, and the trigger pulled. It was a disturbing thing to admit, and the kind of statement that should have led someone to seek help. But Christopher spoke of it as if it were just another fact about his life. Erin felt sympathy for him. She had always been drawn to people who seemed wounded or in need of care. In a way, helping Christopher gave her a sense of purpose she had lost since the miscarriage. Talking with him also distracted her from her own grief. He understood sadness, and she found comfort in that shared understanding. The two began spending more time together. At first, it was within the group of friends they both knew, but as weeks passed, they started meeting when their spouses weren't around. Erin also volunteered at a place called White Rock Horse Rescue, where Christopher and Nicole sponsored horses. Erin spent long hours there, and Christopher often showed up too. Away from the base, in the quiet of the horse rescue, their conversations deepened. Erin felt she could speak openly with him about what she was going through, and he seemed to value her presence as much as she valued his. One Sunday night in February 2014, Christopher and Nicole went over to Erin and Jonathan's home to watch a new episode of The Walking Dead. Jonathan and another friend, Paul, settled into the living room with Nicole. Erin wasn't much interested in the show. She found it too violent. So she excused herself and went to her bedroom to play video games instead. Not long after, Christopher followed her. He loved The Walking Dead, but that night, he chose to sit with Erin instead. They played together for a while, the atmosphere easy, until at some point the game was paused. Erin glanced at him, and something in that moment shifted. They leaned in and kissed. It was a bold choice, considering their spouses were just in the next room. But that kiss was the beginning of something neither of them would easily step away from. From then on, their relationship moved quickly. What had begun as emotional closeness became a physical affair. They found ways to meet in secret, and before long, they were talking about leaving their partners to be together. Christopher often told Erin how good she was with Liberty, his daughter. Erin would sometimes babysit her, and Christopher would comment on how she would make a wonderful stepmother one day. For Erin, those words fed into a growing belief that they might have a future together. But affairs have a way of coming to light. Nicole began to notice changes in her husband. He was distant, distracted. Something was wrong. One day, she checked his phone and found messages between him and Erin. Messages that left no doubt about what was happening. One read, "You're so gorgeous. I think I'm falling for you." Nicole's anger was immediate. She confronted Christopher, and the argument went on for hours. Then she went to Erin and Jonathan's home and told Jonathan what she had discovered. That night was filled with shouting, accusations, and raw emotion. At one point, Nicole pointed a finger at Erin and told her that if she ever saw her with Christopher again, She would kill her. Jonathan stayed quieter through it all, his thoughts and feelings harder to read. But whatever his reaction, the damage to the marriage was clear. After that blow-up, Aaron and Christopher said they would end their affair and focus on their marriages. For a couple of weeks, they kept their distance. But the pull between them was strong, and soon they were back together, knowing all along that their time was limited. Christopher's service was ending on July 4th, 2014, and he planned to move with Nicole and Liberty back to Alaska. Then, just weeks before the move, Aaron found out she was pregnant. The news of the pregnancy brought a very different reaction this time. When Aaron had been expecting before, she had been excited, ready to share the news with everyone. She had posted on social media, celebrating the start of a new chapter. But now, she wasn't sure what to feel. The uncertainty came from one thing: she didn't know who the father was. It could have been Jonathan. It could have been Christopher. She told Christopher about it, and from her words, it seemed she believed he was the father. But there was no way to be completely certain. Christopher's reaction was not one of joy. The possibility of fathering a child with Aaron complicated everything. His marriage was already under strain, and this would make it worse. With his move to Alaska approaching, the timing could not have been worse. On June 28th, 2014, Christopher told a friend he planned to go coyote hunting in Joshua Tree National Park. He also mentioned wanting to explore some abandoned mine shafts, and even talked about setting off a propane tank in one of them. His friend had been planning to go with him, but canceled at the last minute. Christopher decided to go alone. That same day, Aaron told Jonathan she was heading to Joshua Tree as well, saying she wanted to find spots to take her mother when she came to visit. She kissed him goodbye, told him she loved him, and left. Later, it became clear that her real reason for going was different. In the days before, Christopher had told her he had a surprise for her and asked her to meet him out there. Aaron, pregnant and believing the child was his, thought the meeting might bring news she had been hoping for, perhaps that he would leave Nicole and be with her. Jonathan texted her during the day, but she didn't respond. As the hours passed and night fell, she still hadn't returned home. She wasn't answering calls or messages. It was unlike her. By the next morning, Jonathan reported her missing. Police began their search. Given the vastness of Joshua Tree and the desert heat, they considered the possibility that she had gotten lost or dehydrated. Her car was found abandoned, but it wasn't near the entrance to the park where she had said she would be. Investigators spoke to people around the base. Jonathan was looked at first, as is common in cases involving missing spouses, but he was quickly ruled out. Many witnesses placed him on the base the entire day Aaron disappeared. When police spoke to friends and neighbors, they learned about the affair between Aaron and Christopher, and that Aaron might have been pregnant. They also heard about the surprise Christopher had mentioned. They went to question Christopher. He told them he only knew Aaron from volunteering at the horse rescue. At that point, police already knew about the affair, so his denial raised immediate suspicion. 3 days later, he was brought to the station for formal questioning. This time, he admitted there had been a relationship, but claimed it was only emotional, that it had never gone beyond kissing. The questioning lasted hours. Investigators pressed him, telling him they knew he had met Aaron on the day she disappeared, and that he was one of the last people to see her. He denied it. They told him they knew she was pregnant and believed the child was his. He denied that too. Without solid evidence, they couldn't arrest him, but their focus on him only grew stronger. Investigators were concerned that Christopher might try to leave town before they could gather enough evidence. He hadn't been arrested yet, but they were determined to find a way to keep him close. They learned that he owned a potato gun, a device considered illegal in California because it's classified as an explosive. That was enough for them to move in. They arrested him for possessing it, knowing that even if it wouldn't keep him in jail long, it would at least give them the chance to set restrictions. Christopher's time in custody was short. His lawyer posted bail, and he was released. But one of the conditions was that he could not leave the area. That meant he couldn't move to Alaska with Nicole and Liberty as he had been planning, at least not right away. Meanwhile, the search for Aaron continued. Teams scoured the vast desert terrain around Joshua Tree, covering about 1,200 square miles. 6 different law enforcement agencies were involved, along with hundreds of volunteers. It was grueling work in the heat, with temperatures reaching 120 degrees. Days turned into weeks. The search dragged on with no sign of her. Eventually, after nearly 2 months, the decision was made to call off the organized search. August 16th, 2014 was set as the final day. Just as hope was fading, a lead came from an unexpected place. The woman who ran the horse rescue, where both Aaron and Christopher volunteered, had come across some photos Christopher had taken about a week before Aaron disappeared. They were of abandoned mine shafts. She found it unusual and gave them to the police. Investigators studied the photos and were able to pinpoint the exact location where they had been taken. A remote part of the high desert near the Marine base, but outside the boundaries of the national park. A search team went to one of the shafts. They lowered a camera down into the darkness. What they saw at the bottom ended the search. Erin's body lay 140 feet below. She had been strangled with a homemade garrote, a weapon made from chain, rope, or wire. Evidence suggested she had been killed before being thrown into the shaft. Nearby, they found a propane tank tied to her, as if someone had tried to destroy the remains by shooting it. There was also a bullet casing and a homemade torch wrapped in a Marine Corps shirt. DNA testing later confirmed Christopher's DNA on the shirt. Another key piece of evidence was a Sprite bottle found in the shaft. Tests showed the DNA of both Aaron and Christopher on it. This was the physical proof investigators needed. With this evidence in hand, they moved to arrest Christopher. But by then, he was gone. When investigators discovered Christopher was missing, it didn't take long to figure out where he had gone. Despite being told not to leave the area, he had moved with Nicole and their daughter Liberty to Alaska, just as he had originally planned. Authorities tracked him there and arrested him. During the search of his vehicle, they found more evidence linking him to Aaron's death. On his phone and computer were internet searches about how to dispose of a body. Inside the car was a garrote, the same type of weapon that had been found around Aaron's neck in the mine shaft. These discoveries left little doubt in the minds of investigators. Christopher was brought back to California to face charges of first-degree murder, along with a special circumstance charge of lying in wait. The trial began in 2016. The prosecution laid out its case. Christopher had lured Aaron to the desert to kill her, motivated by the desire to keep their affair and possible pregnancy from destroying what was left of his marriage. They called witnesses to the stand, including the owner of the horse rescue, who testified about Christopher's earlier comments. She told the court that Christopher had once casually mentioned finding a mine shaft where no one would ever find someone, and had borrowed a propane tank from her. The owner also recalled a conversation with Nicole shortly after Aaron disappeared. Nicole, she said, had been tense and told her she wished Aaron was dead, and that if there was no body, there would be no case. A criminalist also testified, explaining that the bullet casing found near Aaron's body matched the rifle Christopher had left at the horse rescue. Then came a turning point. On November 4th, 2016, while testifying, Christopher was asked directly by the prosecutor if he was the one who had strangled Aaron. His answer stunned the courtroom. "Yes, I am." Christopher's admission in court was unexpected. Up until that moment, he had denied killing Aaron. Now, with 3 short words, he confirmed what investigators had long believed. He told the court that he had strangled her during what he described as a sudden burst of anger. According to his testimony, they had gone to the desert together near Joshua Tree National Park. Aaron, he claimed, thought the trip was for something special, perhaps even a proposal. Instead, they ended up at the entrance of a mine shaft and began arguing. Christopher said he told Aaron he was moving to Alaska and that their relationship was over. Aaron, he testified, became upset, telling him she still loved him and wanted to go with him. She also mentioned wanting to be part of his daughter's life. It was at that moment, Christopher claimed, that he suddenly accused her of harming his daughter. He told the court that he believed she had been inappropriate with the child and that in response to his confrontation, she confessed. According to Christopher's account, this supposed confession sent him into a rage. He said he came up behind her and strangled her for about 5 minutes. After she stopped moving, he waited for about half a minute to check for signs of life. Then, believing she was gone, he dragged her body to the mine shaft and pushed her in. The prosecutor questioned him sharply. They suggested that his story about Aaron harming his daughter was nothing more than an attempt to gain sympathy from the jury, a way to make his actions appear less premeditated. They pointed out that there was no evidence supporting his claim and that he had only brought it up after being charged. The prosecution also noted that for months after Aaron's death, Christopher had denied any involvement. It wasn't until he was on the stand in front of an audience that he decided to confess. They accused him of making the trial about himself. The jury was not persuaded by his explanation. It took them only about 15 minutes to reach a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. On November 29, 2016, Christopher Lee was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At the sentencing hearing, Aaron's mother spoke to the court. She said she could not understand why anyone would think taking her daughter's life was the answer. If Christopher had wanted to end the relationship, all he had to do was move to Alaska and change his phone number. There had been no need for her daughter to die. Jonathan, Aaron's husband, remained largely silent throughout the case. He gave few interviews and made no public statements during the trial. Those who knew him described him as a quiet man, and he stayed that way even after the verdict. It was clear that the loss had left its mark, though he carried it privately. Christopher's wife, Nicole, kept out of the public eye as well. She did not make public comments about the trial or her husband's conviction. When Christopher spoke after sentencing, he apologized to Aaron's friends and family for the pain he had caused. He said he had not planned to kill her and that he did not want to. Yet even in that statement, he continued to repeat the same story he had told in the stand, the story about Aaron and his daughter. Christopher Lee, 31 at the time of sentencing, was sent to the California Institution for Men in Chino, San Bernardino County. There, as his sentence dictated, he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story. A case that began with quiet beginnings in a small Tennessee town and ended in the stillness of a California desert. Every life touched by it forever changed. If you've been listening until now, I hope the telling has been clear, steady, and easy to follow, and that it's given you space to reflect. If you'd like to hear more stories told this way, I'd be grateful if you tap the like button and subscribe so you never miss the next case. You can close your eyes now. Let the rest of the night be peaceful. The soft sound of rain will carry you from here, and we'll meet again in the next story.